Here we go. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on system goals data. This webinar will be reviewing outcomes from the first 6 months of 2024. My name is Jessie Maldonado, and I'm a project lead on the data and performance team at All Chicago. Very excited to be sharing this data with you all today because this data really helps our homeless response system understand its impact on the system level. We really appreciate your engagement in this webinar and hope that it reveals some new insights and sparks ideas for where we as a CoC can focus on performance. In this webinar, we will cover an overview of the CoC system goals and how they're used to measure progress towards the CoC shared vision at the system level. We'll be sharing some information on how you can use this and other reports to inform and share your own insights beyond what's presented here. We'll discuss outcomes data from January through June of 2024 for Chicago's homeless response system, as well as highlights from the data that we can use to draw insights for our community. This webinar is meant to serve as an overview of the most recent system goals report, and the highlights that we're sharing today are some examples of the insights that can be drawn from this data. I definitely, and will continue to encourage folks to engage further with this data by reviewing the report, which will be available very soon on All Chicago's website. Once it is posted, it will also be shared out through the CoC newsletter, so keep your eyes out there. But first, what are the CoC system goals? They are the Chicago Homeless Response System's way of using HMAS data to measure system-wide progress towards preventing and ending homelessness in Chicago. They reveal what our system has accomplished, and they provide us with information on the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness in Chicago. The CoC has 5 system goals, and each goal has its own metrics that are used to measure progress towards that goal. Goal 1 is to reduce the number of persons experiencing homelessness in Chicago. Goal 2 is to shorten the length of time persons experience homelessness. Goal 3 is that units dedicated to using coordinated entry use that system to fill its units. Goal 4 is to increase the income of adults experiencing homelessness. And goal 5 is that people exit from unsheltered or street homelessness to sheltered destinations or housing. The metrics for these goals are listed on this slide, and we'll review each of these in greater depth as we go through the data. But in addition to providing outcomes for the population as a whole, the report also explores data that's broken down by demographic and other characteristics. So these include age, chronic homeless status, gender, family composition, race and ethnicity, and veteran status. There's also a new breakdown that's being introduced with this report, which allows us to explore outcomes by different project types. And just an overview of all of the updates that we've seen in 2024. The CoC has introduced 2 new metrics. The first one is that in addition to metric 1.1a, which is a daily average of people experiencing homelessness, we're also now sharing a number or account of all people who experience homelessness in the first 6 months of that year. So taking that and deduplicating each of the lists to get a total count. The second is returns to homelessness, which we'll talk more about later and define a little bit more what that means. Additionally, the way that we measure income with metrics 4.1 and 4.2 has been updated, and I'll go into what that looks like now. And then, as I said before, there's a new breakdown category for project types that's shared for all of our metrics. So taking a step back and looking at the overall structure of the report that will be shared out, up top in the beginning, there are highlights and trends that All Chicago team has identified that summarize some of the notable insights from the report. Then there's a review of the system goals at a high level or the aggregate results. And then finally, there's a breakdown of each goal by different demographic and other characteristics. This report serves as a wealth of information related to system performance, and it can help us answer many different types of questions. So for example, we can explore how the number of people housed has changed over time, what % of exits from different project types are to permanent destinations, which populations experience homelessness for the longest length of time, the difference in time from enrollment to move-in, or from coordinated entry, referral to move in between different groups, and so many more questions that this report can help us to answer. So because there's so many things that cannot be contained in this one webinar and in one highlight section of a report, we also want to ask you all to share your insights. While Chicago has identified some things that stand out to us from this data, the report is really rich with potential insights that can be explored. So we want to know what stands out to you and to other CoC members, whether or not you're engaged in a specific CoC committee or work group that dedicates time specifically to exploring these system goals data. So we are now introducing a survey that asks both for feedback that help us improve the presentation of this data, and also asks for you to share your own takeaways about what parts of this data are important and stand out to you. So Doug, if you could share the link to that survey in the chat, it would be fantastic, because I'd love for you all to complete it based on what you learned today. And additionally, once you viewed the report and have really pulled together some additional insights, let us know your thoughts and what stands out to you. The purpose of this survey is to inform CoC committees that are specifically focused on system goals, like the Data and Performance Committee and the System Operation and Performance Committee. And to provide a bit of guidance on how you might form some of these insights, I wanted to share a little bit of information that can help guide that. This is similar to a process that I use myself in identifying insights related to data, especially the system goals data. But first, I think it helps to think of a question that's related to system performance that's important to you. So you could take any of the questions on the previous slides. We can take any other questions that you all are forming in your thoughts related to system performance. And then you can go to the section of the report where that question is most likely to be answered. So if your question relates to how a metric is calculated using HMAS data, you can go to that metric's overview and calculation method in the main body of the report, and that might have your answer there. If your question is about how system-wide data has changed over time, you can go to the tables in the main body of the report, which share these high-level outcomes from the last 3 years for the metrics. And as that last box there, if your question is about how metrics differ by different populations, such as age, race and ethnicity, or veteran status, then you can explore the data tables in the breakdown section of the report, which contain, I'll admit, a lot of data. It's a little heavy on the eyes, but it is a wealth of information that shows this disaggregated data and can really be a source for forming some of those insights. But then, once you've found the data that you're looking for, you can consider any possible contributing factors, think about your thoughts on that data, and share your insights with the survey that we've shared. The survey will also be linked in the report itself, so I would definitely encourage you to share it with others, even if they're not here today, if you think that they'd be interested in exploring this data more deeply and sharing back those insights. So now that we have reviewed the system goals and how you can share your own insights, let's actually dive into the data itself. And we're going to start at a pretty high level. So throughout, I welcome you to engage in conversations about this data by sharing thoughts and questions in the chat. I can answer clarifying questions throughout, and if we have some time at the end, also would love to have some time for some more open-ended discussion and for folks to come off the mute and share their questions. But as a reminder, just the methodologies for calculating each of these metrics is included in the report itself. So my presentation today isn't going to focus so much on how things are calculated. That'll all be in the report. We're going to focus on what the data actually tells us about performance. So let's kick off by talking about how many people are experiencing homelessness in Chicago as indicated by HMAS data. So on an average day in the first 6 months of this year, about 13,676 people were experiencing homelessness. We also often refer to this number as the active list because it counts individuals who are actively experiencing homelessness while engaging in Chicago's homeless response system. This includes individuals that are enrolled in street outreach projects, emergency shelters, transitional housing, and coordinated entry. It also includes people who are enrolled in PSH and RRH before housing move-in if their prior living situation was homeless, other projects if their living situation is homeless, as well as those who have recently exited a project to a homeless or unknown destination. So that's the count of people on an average day. But in total, and this is our new metric, 42,172 people appeared on the active list as having experienced homelessness at some point during the first 6 months of 2024. And then when we think about who is new to that active list, who's newly experiencing homelessness, that is 8,171 people were counted as having newly experienced homelessness. And new to experiencing homelessness is defined as being on the active list for the first time in the last 2 years. Next, we'll look at those housing outcomes. So 972 people moved into CoC housing projects, which include all permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, as well as youth transitional housing that enter data into HMAS. At the time of moving into CoC housing, people had experienced on average 910 days, or about 2.5 years of homelessness up to that point. These next two have to do with the coordinated entry system. So 83% of units committed to using coordinated entry were filled through coordinated entry referrals. And those households experienced on average 61 days, or about 2 months, between the referral and move into that housing. Next, let's look at individuals who are exiting our system. And this includes exits from all types of projects, not just housing projects. While we can see the breakdowns to the types of destinations to which people are exiting in this data, that's all there on the screen there. The most notable thing is the vast amount of exits are to unknown destinations, with 86% being to unknown destinations. This proportion has continued to increase over time. And I do want to mention that while some data on exits will always be unknown, it's impossible to know where every single person is exiting a project to. This high rate is far beyond what should be expected. And this issue is fixable with improved data quality and timeliness. That will definitely help us in understanding how people are moving through our homeless response system. But after looking at unknown destinations, the next highest group is to permanent destinations with 8%, followed by 5% to homeless destinations, 1% to temporary, 1% to institutional, and less than 1% to safe havens and folks that have passed away. Next, let's look at our new metric, returns to homelessness. So this metric looks back at 2 years prior and determines of people during that time that exited to permanent destinations, how many returned to homelessness. And that return is measured by re-enrolling in a project while experiencing homelessness. So out of participants that exited projects in January through June of 2022, 17% returned to homelessness in the following 2 years. 7% of people returned within 6 months, 3% returned between 6 months and 1 year, and 7% returned between 1 and 2 years. And when we add all those up, that's how we get that 17%. Next, we'll review our updated metric, which relates to increases in income over the last 12 months. So these metrics measure the percent of people that are enrolled in permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and youth transitional housing projects that increase their income since entry into that project. It looks at employment income and benefits income like SSI and SSDI separately from one another. And we see that between July 2023 and June of 2024, 6% of people enrolled in permanent supportive housing projects increased their employment income, and 35% increased their benefits income. In rapid rehousing, 9% of people increased employment and 10% increased benefits income. In youth transitional housing, 26% increased employment income and 5% increased benefits income. And in transitional housing, without those youth transitional housing projects, 5% increased employment income and 8% increased benefits income. So we can see that youth transitional housing has the highest rate of increasing employment income, while permanent supportive housing has the highest rate of increasing benefits. And then our last system goal metric looks specifically at street outreach programs. So in January through June of 2024, there were 5,663 people enrolled in street outreach at some point. 1,082, or nearly 1/5 of these people, had a recorded exit at one point. If we look to that graphic on the right, there's that represented by that blue box there, which shows the percent of people that had exits during that time period. And then the red people on the graphic represent the proportion of people who exited from street outreach to a shelter destination, which was 46% of all of those exits. So that's everything at a high level, at an aggregate level. Now I'll pause to take a look at the chat really quickly. Oh, well, thank you, Doug, for answering some questions in the chat already. Wonderful. Okay, Doug, are you good to keep answering questions in the chat while I talk through this? Awesome. Alrighty, got it handled. And feel free to raise anything to me if it makes sense in the conversation. Alrighty. So that was our high-level view at outcomes. Now we're going to transition into talking about trends over time and highlights from this data. So the number of people experiencing homelessness as measured through our active list has risen over the last year and a half, as have the number of people new to homelessness. The chart on the left there shows the daily average number of people experiencing homelessness over the last 4.5 years. And the chart on the right shows the monthly average number that were new to homelessness. So in January through June of 2024, each month, 1,362 people were new to homelessness, and that's what that's showing there. I do also want to mention that in September of 2022, the active list did begin fully including people who were enrolled in coordinated entry. So for that reason, the numbers are not fully comparable year to year. We did see a jump from 2022 to 2023, which at least in part could be due to the shift in logic. But I will say our numbers from the last 2 years are somewhat comparable to each other, and we still see that increase between them. Next, when we look at the number of people who moved into housing projects over time, we see that there was a decrease from 2021 to 2022 and from 2022 to 2023. But however, in the first 6 months of this year, there were more people housed than there were in the first 6 months of 2023. So we may see increased numbers for all of 2024 if that rate continues at which people are housed. But it is important to look at a full year's worth of data in order to determine that. But again, and I mentioned it earlier, 972 people were housed in the first 6 months of this year, which is higher than the 656 that were housed in the first 6 months of 2023. So even though this number is higher, the need for housing continues to exceed what can be provided with available CoC housing resources alone. This is a comparison between our metrics 1.2 and 1.1a. So on average, for every person who was housed in the CoC housing projects in the first 6 months of this year, 9 people became newly homeless. And this really highlights the importance of strengthening housing pathways, both inside our CoC as well as outside of our CoC. But of those people that were housed in CoC housing projects, the average length of time they were experiencing homelessness prior to being housed, it's been fluctuating somewhat over the last 5 years, but there was an increase between 2022 and 2023 of just over 1 month. This number has continued to increase and is now at an average of 910 days, or about 2.5 years. While this demonstrates that people are experiencing homelessness for longer, it also indicates that people who have been experiencing homelessness for longer are being housed in projects. Next, system goal 3 looks at the percent of committed units that were filled through coordinated entry referrals. Over the past few years, we've seen this proportion dropping from 91% in 2021 to 88% in 2022 to 82% in 2023. In the first 6 months of this year, we are seeing similar outcomes that are a little bit higher than the previous year, with 83% of people being housed through coordinated entry. All Chicago does serve as the coordinated entry lead for the CoC and is working with the coordinated entry leadership team to understand barriers and identify opportunities to provide technical assistance to improve those rates of coordinated entry use in the CoC. But after folks receive that coordinated entry referral, we can look at the number of days that they experience between that referral and moving into housing. And this number has decreased from the previous year. It's now at an average of 61 days, which is a 23-day decrease from 2023's average, this one is moving in the right direction. And then again, our last goal, goal 5, which looks at street outreach, shows us that the proportion of people exiting street outreach to a shelter destination has increased over the last year and a half. We now see that people are exiting street outreach enrollments. Of people exiting street outreach enrollments, 46% are entering shelter destinations, which could be anything from an emergency shelter to CoC housing, or another form of temporary or permanent living situation outside of the CoC. So now that we've looked at things on a high level, we've looked at some overtime data, I want to take a moment to pause and let's check the chat to see if there are any questions that want to discuss. Doug, is there anything that we should raise up right now? But if anyone has questions or highlights that really stuck out to them, please feel free to raise them in the chat.
I'm trying to keep up, but everyone's got great questions. So if anyone feels like it's a good time that they want to speak up to ask a verbal question, go ahead.
Any comparisons to national data or other CoCs is something that I do not know right now. This is something that we're able to calculate based on access to our own HMAS data, and I'm not sure if comparable data is out there, but it's definitely a great thing to look into, and would be interested if anyone does have that information that they can please share in their CoC groups or in other, even through the survey. I think that's a great place to share that type of information as well. And Nancy, I hear what you say about adding the population count to charts. I think it's a good thing, and I didn't want to overcomplicate us with too many numbers over there. But all of the ends for many of our metrics are included in the report themselves. But Nancy, I see your hand up. Do you want to come off of mute? Nancy?
Okay, that took me a moment. Sorry, lost track of my mouse. This might be trying to draw too strong of a conclusion from what you've presented, but I'm trying to understand the trends. So what caught my eye is first the sort of negative trends, which is that on a typical day, more people are experiencing homelessness, a notable amount more, like 2,000 more than last year on a typical day. And that length of time homeless is increasing. But then you did share some positive trends, which is that we're housing more people so far this year, and the time from match to housing is going down. I'm trying to square the two of them together. Like how can both be true. And I'm wondering if this kind of points us back to the demand exceeding supply, essentially, that even as we are making improvements in housing people, there's still way more people entering the system, and we're also still playing catch up from sort of like longer and longer ago that and that's contributing to like that length of time and so forth. Is that correct, or have others drawn different conclusions? I'm kind of trying to make sense of what these trends are telling us.
Nancy, I think you're identifying wonderful hypotheses on this data, and that's exactly what we're asking of the community and the committees that are working on this and folks in the survey to really think about what they know about our system and think about the factors that are at play and help us to make sense of this data that we can use to form helpful insights. And while what we're really focusing on here is talking about the data and really sharing that out in hopefully a more accessible way than the report alone, that it leads to all of these questions, right? And it also leads us to the conclusion that a lot of these things, while our system does have some influence over it, or our homeless response system does, a lot of them are factors that are outside of that, right? Like our homeless response system, while it has some influence in the number of people that are experiencing homelessness in Chicago, it doesn't have all the influence. There are countless factors that play into that, and countless factors that play into how long people are experiencing homelessness. But a wonderful line of thinking, and we definitely want that to continue. I don't necessarily have any answers for you in that, and I apologize, but yeah, hopefully those are conversations that we can continue throughout our CoC. Okay.
Jesse, can I call out one other thing there? Thank you, Jesse, for addressing the big picture of that. Also, I just want to note that there is a nuance to that 972 days, which is only measuring the people who entered housing. Right now, we don't have a measure sort of for how long people are experiencing homelessness, like maybe who are on the active list or whatever. It's just not currently part of our metrics. So, and as you can imagine, obviously the people who enter housing, their length of time homeless can be, sort of correlated to who ends up being selected for our very limited supplies of housing. It's not a direct factor, I believe, in selecting, but it is certainly a correlated one. So, yeah, so we see that number move, but we should just be careful not to think of it as necessarily how long the average person who's experiencing homelessness has been homeless.
And
Does
Maurice,
that mean, sorry, if they exit on their own, that it's not counted?
Yeah, those are only people, sorry, I should have Jesse. Those are only people who enter those CoC housing. So those 9, so wait, no, that's a good question in the chat too. So 910 is how many people entered housing in the last 6 months, right? Jesse, can you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Yes, that's actually a count of people, 910. 972 is the average number of days. It's just a coincidence that they're
you have
close.
those. Sorry, 972 is the number housed, 910 is the number of days.
You sure? Oh, you're right, which means I'm putting the wrong number. Sorry, I put some wrong information in the chat. Thank you, Jesse.
No worries. Again, it highlights there's a lot of data here. I did see Maurice in the chat when tracking people whose first time was experiencing homelessness. Why consider just the last 2 years or not longer? Wondering if we expand those years, would it increase or decrease the number of people who became newly homeless due to people moving up, potential waiting lists for housing, and other opportunities that may take more time to access? It's a good question. If we did look at a longer period of time, it would decrease the number of people that we're considering new to the active list. So that's how those numbers would work. I can't necessarily say by how much. But in terms of the reasoning for that, these are metrics that are defined by the CoC, and that was what was selected, that if somebody is not experiencing homelessness for 2 years and then re-enters homelessness, that's the point that we're counting them new to the active list. But they're counted as on the active list regardless of the amount of time. And it's a HUD-defined methodology. Thank you, Doug, as well. Chris? And then this is the last question I'll take before moving on. Want some more data. Yeah, Chris, go for it.
Yeah, couple things. I'm wondering, because sometimes people have multiple entries in the system, could that be accounting for longer time accredited because they're just not exited out of the programs? Like potentially they could actually be housed, but they're still seeking drop-in services, or they might even be in shelter. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're housed let's say they're housed a little more precariously, where there's still a lot of things going on, but they're still keeping their subsidy. And if they're floating in to other parts of the crisis system, could that potentially be adding to the total number? And then I had a thought, when we get to certain parts of the year, at least within certain populations, like such as youth, sometimes they can stay different places, and we have a lot of people dropping in and out of inactivity. So could the answer be, I know some people are probably not going to love this idea, but perhaps when you get around to the end of the year, let the inactivity list become 120 days as opposed to 90. Just something to consider. You could start it on a small portion and just see how the trends actually keep people from coming back in and out as often. That way it's easier to track them down and their information might be more stable. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, so many thoughts with what you said, and thank you for for mentioning it. I think one thing that what I think about when you said the first part of your statement regarding just like open enrollments that should maybe be closed out, I think that data quality plays a really important role in a lot of these metrics. That's something that's called out in the report, and something that we're really working across the system to improve across the board. So yes, that has an influence on almost every one of our metrics. Regarding exploration on the active list and lengthening the amount of time for inactivity, I can't speak to necessarily what analysis is available. I know that our HMAS team has a limited capacity to take requests, but that in the past, different committees that are working on this data have made requests for further data exploration, especially if it's backed with some sort of strategic purpose. So yeah, Chris, I think you're in a place that if you wanted to propose that through committees, that it could be happening. But yeah, definitely also similar insights to what we want to collect in that survey. So thank you all to everyone who spoke up and shared in the chat today for that discussion and examples for the types of discussions we're hoping to start. With that, and forgive me if folks had other questions or one that they wanted to highlight. If we have time at the end, definitely want to have some more of this discussion going on. But I also want to move into our data highlights from the breakdowns. So the demographic data has also revealed some really interesting insights, and these are called out in the report's highlight section. The data itself can actually be found in the breakdown section in the appendix. So we're going to highlight as many as we have time for right now, and I highly encourage you all to view the report and draw additional highlights from this data disaggregated. But when we look at who is served by Chicago's homeless response system, we see that it is primarily individuals that are Black or African American, with 73% being the majority by far, followed by 10% of the active list being white, 7% being Hispanic or Latino, 6% being multiracial, 2% being another race or ethnicity, and 2% not responding to that data field. It is also important to mention that it can be difficult, again, when we talk about our comparing data over time, to compare race and ethnicity data to prior years because of updates to the HMAS data standards. And we mentioned this in the past couple of reports, but it continues to come into play when we think about our comparability of data. But in the past, race and ethnicity were collected as separate data elements. Beginning in October of last year, the elements were combined, and they now allow individuals to select multiple answers that align with their racial and ethnic identity. So as a result of that, many individuals that were previously listed as either Black or white may now be included in the multiple races or ethnicities category in reflection of that selected identity. Additionally, we've also seen some differences in data entry practices with that change from having ethnicity as a separate element to now having it combined. We're also seeing that more people have selected the single response of Hispanic, Latina, and that response is becoming more common, whereas right after the change, we were seeing it more common that folks were reporting they were white and Hispanic. So we're continuing to monitor these responses over time and see what it makes sense to report out on. We want to report on the most prevalent groups. So this is the breakdown that is shown in this report here. And then if you do look at the data in the report's appendix, you'll see why it's not as comparable over time, because those categories have shifted somewhat. Another thing that has changed in the breakdown categories is the way that chronic homelessness status is determined. So All Chicago has updated this methodology to align more closely with the HUD Longitudinal System Analysis Report, or LSA, which counts all time that people self-report experiencing homelessness. Previously, the way our CoC measured it allowed for some self-reported data, but a certain amount of time did need to be documented through HMAS enrollments. But since this change has been made, more people are being counted as experiencing chronic homelessness. And the report says this, and I want to reiterate it, that this increase is not necessarily reflective of people's different experiences, or differences in people's experiences, but it does impact the way that our CoC can understand the extent to which people experience chronic homelessness. And this next slide here has some graphs that can show us the differences. So when we look at our active list data over time, which is represented by that gray line there, we see an increase in the proportion of people that are chronically homeless between 2022 and 2023. That's when the methodology was changed for that metric. But now we see that the percent of people who are actively experiencing homelessness, that 27% of them are also experiencing chronic homelessness. For the other metrics, this change took place in 2024 and can be seen in this report. So when we look at metric 1.2, which measures the number of people housed, we see a large jump in the percent of people that the CoC housed that were experiencing chronic homelessness, from 12% in 2023 to 44% in January through June of 2024. And again, just saying it again, it's not necessarily that more people are experiencing chronic homelessness, but rather that this measurement has changed, and we can now say that these people are experiencing chronic homelessness under this new measure. So it really prioritizes that serving chronic homeless populations is a priority, that many people in our system are experiencing chronic homelessness. And we now have this data measure that's more aligned with the way that HUD measures it. And if anyone does have questions on like the specifics of that change, there is a lot more information in the report itself about it. The data dictionary also has a definition for how chronic homelessness is measured. So I encourage those to go there, but really what this is doing is being more accurately reflective of people's own accounts of their experiences of homelessness versus enforcing that a certain amount of it has to be documented through HMAS data. I have two more breakdowns to share here, and they both look at data broken down by different project types. And then after that, we can have some more discussion as well. But this chart here looks at the average number of days that people experienced homelessness prior to moving into a CoC housing project. And again, this is the number of days for people who were housed, not all people that are served in the system. But we see that that people who moved into permanent supportive housing projects experience homelessness on average the longest at 1,324 days, or over 3.5 years prior to being housed in the CoC. We will likely continue to see this higher number in future data because for PSH programs, individuals must be experiencing chronic homelessness as an eligibility requirement for those projects. So also tied into the other measures that we have here. And then the last data breakdown I have to share with you today is the rate of returns to homelessness that's separated out by project type. So this is our new metric that's disaggregated by our new breakdown category. So after exiting from the project type that's listed on the left there, the bars on the right show what % of people return to homelessness in the following 2 years. So that dark part of the bar is telling that. We can see that the highest rate is for rapid rehousing, with 22% of people exiting from rapid rehousing to permanent destinations returning to homelessness at some time in the following 2 years. We also see that permanent supportive housing had the lowest rate of returns, with only 2% of people returning to homelessness after exiting to a permanent destination. So again, this project type breakdown is, I think, a really helpful one to have. This new metric is a really helpful one to have. And while we only have 6 months worth of data that available right now, it's going to be really interesting and important to continue to evaluate, to continue to monitor what we're seeing in this metric over time, especially once we have a full year's worth of data come next January. And with that, I just want to highlight where you all can learn some more about system goals data. So the January through June 2024 system goals report is going to be released shortly. It'll be on the All Chicago website on the HMAS data reports page, along with all past reports and future reports will be posted there. It'll also be shared out through the CoC newsletter. Other places that you can learn more about system goals data is through the HMAS data dashboard, which are all linked in these slides here, as well as all found on the All Chicago website and linked in the slides, as well as the joining conversations, joining a CoC committee or affinity group. Some committees and groups do have conversations on this data or other system-wide factors that definitely relate to this data. And I will send out another reminder for that survey, Doug, if you could share it in the chat, maybe 2 more times before we end here today. But please, please, please take a look at the report, share your additional insights, share your feedback on this webinar. I want to hear it all and really appreciate it. But yeah, with that, I would love to continue this conversation because I think we're having some really good discussions here. So if there's anything on any of the data breakdowns that we talked about.
There is one from the chat. This is Doug, everyone. Hi. One from the chat that I need to call out, which is Nancy, your question about the nature of the change. I don't think I caught the context for that. If you want to clarify that question.
Sorry, and it might be too detailed, Jesse. I know you said we could go look into it. I was wondering if you could summarize the essence of how you changed the change in how you measure chronically homeless.
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, I didn't want to bog people down with too much methodology talk in this conversation, but it's a good question. So my understanding of the change in the methodology is that the length of time somebody needs to be experiencing disability is, having a disability is a qualifier for experiencing chronic homelessness combined with the length of time component. And that length of time component is that person has been experiencing homelessness continuously for the last 12 months or for at least 1 year in the last 3 years. And that's defined by HUD. The difference in the change here is that previously the CoC said that, and I can't remember the percent off the top of my head, and I apologize for that, but that some portion of this data needed to be documented in HMAS enrollments, either through street outreach, through shelter, through another type of engagement in a project while experiencing homelessness, where the rest of it could be self-reported. The change is that HUD's analysis looks at all time that's been self-reported. So when people do an entry assessment into projects, they ask a question, how long have you been experiencing homelessness? And from the day that that started to that moment is counted as having experienced homelessness. So that's the change here, is that while time that is documented through enrollments is still counted, there's no limit on the amount of time that can be self-reported. So this is more reflective of people's experiences of homelessness as they recount them, and not only through engagement with Chicago's HMAS. And I hope that answered your question and didn't get too in the weeds. And Shannon, so I'm assuming the chronic status for family households is applied to all members of a household based on HUD's guidance. I believe that the chronic homeless status eligibility requirement is for the head of household when it's an eligibility requirement for households. I'm not so sure if it applies to members of the household. I believe that each participant in HMAS would have their own record of experiencing homelessness that isn't related to the head of household if they aren't enrolled in projects together all the time. And Kimberly, I appreciate your enthusiasm and am also glad to have this new metric on returns to homelessness. I think new metrics are always exciting in what they can tell us and point us in directions for improvement for our system.
Do you mind going back to that new metric returns to homelessness slide just for a moment, please?
Yeah, are you interested in the project type one or the overall?
By project, please.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I was like fixating on the rapid rehousing one and want to just look at the other ones.
Yeah, so in order, and I can tell them for other folks, we have rapid rehousing, followed by transitional, followed by emergency sheltered, street outreach, youth transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing at the rate of returns.
And I'll give, this is Doug, I'll give Jesse a break from talking for a moment, because I'll reemphasize to everyone that the thing with returns is that you have to have exited to a permanent destination to begin with. So when we see higher rates for something like rapid rehousing, they have higher rates of exits to permanent destinations to start with, whereas it's a little rarer to see those exits to permanent destinations from shelter or street outreach, for example.
Got it. That's helpful.
Yeah, ultimately, HUD wants us to sort of combine these two to understand who exited to, to look at who exited to a non-permanent destination to start with, and then for those who did look to a permanent one, to continue to look to see if they showed back up in the system.
Yeah, and Alexis, I don't know that I'm fully answering your question on keeping up with folks afterwards, but I will also say that this metric is not based on follow-ups that the project has to do. So it's not like somebody from emergency shelter is contacting participants to ask whether they've returned to homelessness. It's a return to homelessness is actually measured when somebody re-enrolls in a project. So for example, if somebody exits from a rapid rehousing project and they say that they're moving to a permanent destination, and then 10 months later, they enroll in an emergency shelter or a street outreach program, that's when we say somebody has returned to homelessness. So it does rely on our system's reach and our ability to reach folks that need that are experiencing homelessness and would find these services beneficial. But it's not required on contacting individuals on the project end of things.
Got it. Thank you, Jesse. And so I assume that this is only measuring returns to Chicago HMIS
That is correct.
engagement? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes left, but I'm happy to give you all a few moments back today. I really appreciate the engagement here, and even just your attendance alone is very appreciated. If there are any last minute questions, I'll let you formulate them. Well, again, I plug to please look at the report. Please find out more information on the system goals data. Please continue to engage in this, and to please fill out this survey to share with others who you think would find this data really interesting to dive deeper into. But thank you all. We'll stop the recording and we'll be good to go.